Guten Tag, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren. Die Geländegewänne der ukrainischen Streitkräfte geben Anlass zur Hoffnung. So gibt es auch erste Stimmen, die davon sprechen, dass die Ukraine tatsächlich in diesem Herbst den Krieg gewinnen könnte. Der Behörden Spiegel nimmt sich nun zum mittlerweile dritten Mal in einer Defense Day-Runde dem Thema des Ukraine-Krieges an. Diesmal konnten wir mit dem Transatlantic Dialogue Center politische Entscheidungsträger direkt aus Kiew als Redner gewinnen. Wir haben Abgeordnete des Nationalparlaments, die zum Teil Kriegsteilnehmer waren oder sind, als Redner gewinnen können, um uns die Geschehnisse in der Ukraine direkt perspektivisch aufzuzeigen. This dialogue will principally held in English due to our guest from Ukraine. And please remember to use chat if you have any questions or comments. I now hand over to Reinhard Wolski for his chair in this Defense Day. Welcome.
As a Ukrainian Member of Parliament, Mrs. Inna Sovsun focuses on the following: renewable energy development in Ukraine, as well as European Green Deal implementation in Ukraine. Ms. Sovsun, we are very, very glad to have you with us and that you could manage to be into our Defense Day. You have the word.
Well, thank you, Reinhard, for such an in-depth presentation. I'm sorry if there is some problem with connection. The reality is that joining for this event took me quite some effort. As you can imagine, because of the security situation, it's not safe for us to work from the Parliament building. So we typically work from our homes or any other outside offices that we have. Unfortunately, at my place, I don't have any power right now. So I was planning to join from the local community internet place. But about 20 minutes ago, an air alert started in Kiev, and that community internet place shuts down during the air raid alert. So I had to search for some other place to join in. And in this situation, this is the local cafe, which doesn't shut down during the air raid alert and also has the generator to work during the power cuts. But that I'm explaining all that just to explain the situation that we're all living in. And the constant threat of air raid alerts. I don't know what is happening right now, if you hear some explosions or if anything happens, just so you know, I have to tell you that there is an air raid alert right now as we speak in Kiev. And also under constant air raid threat, which often result in the missile attacks that actually hit some targets, typically energy infrastructure, but as you well know, last Saturday, unfortunately, it hit a residential building and the whole country has been in shock. We lost over 40 people in a relatively peaceful city of Dnipro in central Ukraine in just one hit. So this is the situation that we are all living in for almost a year now. And we did manage to stand, we did manage to fight back because of the immense strength and courage and resilience of the Ukrainian soldiers and civilian people as well, but also because our Western allies have been helping us to a very big extent. And trust me, we are very grateful to every single government that is helping Ukraine. Germany is, of course, one of the biggest contributors to helping Ukraine military-wise. And trust me, we recognize that, we know that, we are extremely, extremely helpful for the IRIS-T system, which is now protect our sky together with other air defense systems that we had our own, but also those that have been provided to us by our allies. So that all is crucial for us in order to ensure that we actually manage to fight back and eventually at some point to win in this terrible, unjustified war that Russia started against us. And I'm here speaking as a Ukrainian politician, as a Ukrainian citizen, and unfortunately I'm in a situation where I have to address you and to ask for more help to be provided to Ukraine. And again, I'm saying that fully recognizing that Germany is at this point one of the biggest contributors to Ukrainian defense. But unfortunately, Russian military power is just too great. Not a single country in Europe would be able to withstand Russian aggression of this size alone. And I'm sure that be it Germany, France, Sweden, Poland, whichever country, every single one of us would not be able to withstand this level of threat by ourselves. And of course, for Germany or France or Poland, for that matter, it would have been easier because they are NATO members. We, unfortunately, as of right now, are not. So we do have to address you as non-NATO member countries, but we're still asking you for help. And we are doing that because we believe that the war that we're in is so unjustified, is so much against any basic principles of international law, of international order, that regardless of whether we are NATO member state or not, we are fighting for the principles that we all share. And that is why I'm here to ask you to help us fight back. And what is also most important, the tanks available in the biggest number on the European continent. That is the major reason why we are asking Germany to help with this specific issue. Because yes, the UK does have the Challenger tanks, but the numbers are just not big enough. If you look at the sheer number of tanks that are available, Leopards are just available in biggest number on the European continent. Then, of course, one can say that the Americans have the tanks. Of course, they do. They do have the Abramses, which are also very good tanks, which are also available in big numbers. There are two issues with why Abramses are not that well suited for Ukrainian military. And that is why we are maybe slightly too pushy, but still asking Germany to intervene here and to help. And not because it's a German tank, but simply because this is the tank that is basically a European tank. And you have seen that several European countries, Poland, Finland, are willing to contribute their Leopard tanks. We are losing in close combat in Bakhmut, in Kremenna, in other areas in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. I also know that from my friends who are serving, from my partner who is serving in Donbass, in the area near Bakhmut. So I do have very personal connection to that area and a very personal knowledge of the situation over there. What we are facing there is very close combat in the trenches where tanks actually really, really matter. And that is why we keep on asking for those tanks, because in this military situation, tanks would mean saving lives every single day for us. That is why I have to address you again and again and ask for this decision to be taken. I truly do not fully understand the argument that providing tanks would lead to escalation, because I think that by this time, it's obvious to everybody that the only way to de-escalate the situation is to help Ukraine to win in this terrible war of aggression launched against us. Putin is not going to stop. Look, he bombed a residential building, over 40 people dead because of that. This is the true escalation. And the only way to stop this escalation is unfortunately military-wise. It should become clear to every single person that this is the only way to win this.
So what we possibly would look for is a battalion-sized Leopard delivery, plus, of course, the logistics and the training. There are very many different Leopards in Europe, you know that as well. But I think things are moving, and things are moving fast. And things are, I guess, moving fast in favor of Ukraine regarding that issue of Leopard tanks and main battle tanks for the Ukraine. I have a question. How is the parliamentary business going on in times like these? We take it very serious if you look at Berlin and Bonn, but how do you sustain parliamentary work?
Thank you very much. Before I do that, I will mention one more thing in addition to what you just said about the training to use the tanks. And you are right that because there are different models of Leopards available, and of course it will take time for our soldiers to learn how to use them, but it will still be easier to train them to use different types of Abramses than to train them to use different types of Leopards, but then also different types of Abramses that are available. So it's still easier to train them to use one tank, which would be Leopard, and potentially we would expand the fleet and then buy them maybe in the future. Then to train them to use both Leopards and Abramses at the same time. That is one of the arguments that I get from talking to the military. Is of course it's easier to train them to use single type of weapon than different types of weapons. Getting to your question about how the parliament is functioning. Well, very difficult, of course. As you can see, we are not advised to work from our parliamentary offices. We had to continue working mainly online to a very big extent as we started during the COVID times. Also, meeting in the parliament is dangerous. We still meet basically every week or every other week, 2-3 times a month. We still meet for 1 or 2 day sessions. They are not advertised in advance. They are not announced in advance. We are not allowed to publish any information about the session as it is happening. Though the truth be told, some of the MPs do break those rules, but it is not allowed to do so because of security reasons, because we understand that Parliament, as the single major democratic institution in Ukraine, is constantly a target. And I'll tell you this, last week we had a parliamentary session for 2 days, and one of the days we had to delay the start of the session for almost 2 hours because we were under air raid a lot, as we are right now as we speak. And of course, it's dangerous anywhere to be under air raid a lot, but it's particularly dangerous when you are at the decision-making center, be it the parliament, the government building, or ministerial buildings. So it's not allowed to be outside of the bomb shelter when the air raid alert is on, which does happen pretty often. But we still meet, we still adopt legislation. We typically don't have big debates on the floor, well, for multiple reasons. Just a major reason, of course, is that we don't want to spend too much time inside the building, but we still need to adopt the legislation, the changes that need to be made to run the country. But also what is probably even equally important is that we have to show to the Ukrainian people that political leadership of the country is still at place. We are still here. We are together with the Ukrainians. We are not running away. And I think that is crucially important to show. That we typically, like the majority of the parliament is in there. Of course, there are some MPs from the pro-Russian political group which have either left or they have lost their mandates because they have lost their citizenship, because we learned that they also have Russian citizenship at the same time. We did take 4 decisions like this last week. So we dismissed the mandate, the parliament. So they're not members of parliament anymore. People that we got confirmation of having Russian citizenship as well. So this has taken place. Again, pro-Russian groups, some of them have left, some of them just gave up their mandate, stopped being MPs themselves, some of them lost because of the parliamentary decisions. But we're still here, we are still working, and we continue to try to help the people as much as we can. By legislative work, many MPs are engaged in humanitarian aid and relief efforts, particularly those on the east of the country. But then also I have some MPs who I'm friends with on west of Ukraine who are running humanitarian hubs in Lviv or in Ivano-Frankivsk and helping the areas that are struggling. Lots of MPs are, of course, working internationally. We do have members of parliament who are serving in the army, 2 of them from our political party, including my best friend in the parliament, Roman Kostanko, who is a colonel in the army and serving in Kherson right now. So members of parliament find different ways of being useful. I will tell you this, I'm actually even surprised to what extent members of parliament continue to serve in whatever capacity is possible.
Thank you very much indeed. And I think this is really a signal of resilience of democratic principles to the world, that Parliament under that pressure, under war, is actually functioning, giving guidance, doing legislation, even when the bombs of the Russians are homing in. So I think we should take that in the free world and in the West as a signal of resilience of democratic principle. Thank you very much indeed for that. You are a specialist on education, and as we know, COVID-19 was quite a nuisance on education. Now you have this the war, and how do you basically manage? We hear that the Ukraine via online actually is educating and training children in Germany, which is a system which quite works well, as I heard. What are your experiences, and how do you manage to provide education to the next generation?
Thank you for that question. This is indeed often an issue that we don't talk too much about, but I am extremely concerned about that because, okay, on a personal example, I have a son who is 10 years old. He is in 4th grade. His school is actually nearby from where I'm talking right now. And he didn't have a single school year where he would go to school full time the whole year, because the COVID started when he was in grade 1. Then the war started when he was in grade 3. And he has always had some period of times when he would switch to online learning. Luckily, he has a good school which has everything arranged, and of course he has a computer at home, he has a space, he has the internet at home. So we did as much as we could to make sure that he gets access to education as good as possible. The reality is difficult, however, for different kids. Well, of course, in general, for primary school kids, online learning, even if it is properly arranged, is still very complicated. When you have to teach a child, a 6-year-old, how to write properly, you have to be near the child. If the teacher is not nearby, it will be very difficult for a child to understand how to write, right? So it's still going to be very difficult for primary school kids. So whenever possible, the primary schools have been reopened first when that was possible. But then, of course, the war, and particularly now, the war has added additional challenges. We had kids in Kharkiv who spent 3 months living in the underground stations. Of course, they couldn't continue their learning because it was just impossible, and they were constantly being bombed. So we do have other challenges now compared to COVID, but even in COVID times, it was not perfect. I mean, I know Ukraine is still probably better in providing learning compared to many other European countries. Quite unexpectedly, we are relatively good at that. But still, we had kids who don't have computers or other gadgets at home. We do have kids who have very bad internet, particularly in the rural area. We do have families where there are 2, 3 kids and 1 computer, so they had to choose which class they go to. That was all still the problems of COVID. But now with the war, we do have other problems. Again, as I mentioned, some kids were able to continue their education spring last year, those in the Western Ukraine. Some kids, like kids in Kharkiv, they were not able to study for 3-4 months at all. So that creates huge inequalities in access to education. Then the second issue is now with the blackouts. Many parents, particularly of those of kids of high school, of all the kids, who can study online quite efficiently, unlike the primary school kids. So many parents chose that they will allow their kids to study online when that was functioning pretty well. Now suddenly we have the power cuts, the blackouts, and online doesn't work when you don't have the power, and you don't have the power in these houses. You don't have the power from this time to that time, and other kids would not have power in different times. So you cannot do online under this situation that we are under right now. So we kind of adjusted to online learning, but then suddenly online learning is not an option for majority of kids in Ukraine because of the power cuts. So that is a challenge that we still don't know how to address. And I'm afraid that it would lead to devastating results in the mid and long-term perspective, because kids are losing the chance to get proper education. And that is just terrifying, because if, again, being an education expert, I know for sure that if a kid misses 3 months of mathematics, if he or she doesn't get additional classes after that, he would not be able to catch up. You know, this is going to have a long-lasting effects on our society, on its economics, on innovations, on everything. So I'm extremely concerned about this, and I hope that we would be able to pay more attention to that once the military tension is over. But we will need lots of resources to help our kids to catch up and to to catch up, to learn what they missed. And we would have to work on individual strategies for different kids. Again, kids are in such different conditions right now that we will have to adjust to different pace learning for different kids in Ukraine.
Thank you very much indeed. So on the short time, it's leopards. On the long term or medium term, it's about not losing the young generation, basically, by losing education and so on. And I think some things can be done by delivering computers and so on. But it's a critical question, I think, for the next generation in Ukraine, as it was also in other states due to COVID-19. Same problem, but quite tougher. So, but I from the chat, I've got the gold question for you. Basically, what steps towards peace could be made? Could there be any negotiations with Mr. Putin, or do we have to wait with the Russia negotiations without Putin? What's your assessment? It's a kind of tricky question, I know.
Well, it's tricky and yet not so tricky, truth be told, because for us it is that we cannot negotiate with Putin. And trust me, I'm saying that with it. Again, as I mentioned, my partner is serving near Bakhmut. I'm waking up every morning being afraid to text him and waiting for a response till he responds and says that he is okay. That is, and I've been living like this for 11 months now. I don't sleep very well, I'll tell you the truth. And I wish I could say that there is a solution to this war which does not involve my partner and millions of other Ukrainians risking their lives every single day. But unfortunately, there is none. Negotiating with Putin is impossible. Show me a single person on the whole planet who will say that whatever Putin agrees to, we will make sure that he fulfills his promises. I'm absolutely sure that there is not a single person who can guarantee what Putin will and will not do. He is unpredictable. He's lying all the time. Look, 2 days before the full-scale attack on Ukraine, he went on television and said that he is not planning to attack Ukraine. And then bombs started exploding in Ukrainian cities. That is the reality. We cannot trust what he says. We cannot trust what he promises. He did promise, if you remember, the last thing that he did promise publicly was the Christmas ceasefire. I asked our guys in Bakhmut, was there any type of ceasefire? And there wasn't. They continued to bomb our positions. They continued to bomb civilian buildings, residential buildings. We had air raid alert 3 hours after the announced ceasefire. This is just clearly shows that we simply cannot trust whatever Putin says. That is why any negotiations are just a stolen technique for Putin, a way for him to regain power, and that's just it. So unfortunately, and again, I'm saying that with a very heavy heart. Unfortunately, the only solution to this war is military, or maybe some accidental change of regime in Russia, which would lead to disbalances of power, of lack of vacuum of power in Russia, and then maybe we can negotiate. But until that happens, we cannot negotiate, because he simply will not keep his word. He will not do that, because his hatred toward Ukraine and Western values is so very deep that he just cannot stop. He hates everything we stand for. He sees democracy as a threat to himself. He sees Western values as a threat to Russia. He will not stop. He has been planning this war, this big war, for years and years, and he's not planning to stop. We did try to negotiate with him. We had Minsk 1, we had Minsk 2 agreements. Look, they didn't work. They led to even bigger war. When we were under those agreements, Putin continued to gather forces to attack us. So unfortunately, we should give up any illusions that it's possible to negotiate and accept very harsh for us primarily, that unfortunately we have to end this war militarily.
Much indeed, Member of Parliament, Ms. Sofsun, and we are closing this session with you now, and we wish you good luck personally, the Parliament, the Ukraine, and also your partner who is serving at the front. We know how the war is, and thank you very much indeed for your deep insights into what's going on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. And for the help that Germany is providing. Trust me, it is appreciated, even if
we keep on
regardless
pressing.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. We appreciate it
so
a lot.
Much. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
So, ladies and gentlemen, dear audience, I would like to introduce our industry partner now, Mr. Viktor Babušak, and CEO, and Mr. Silvio Stockman. He is advisor of the DIHAG Holding GmbH.
Very good morning. First of all, thank you very much for your attention, and let me allow you to introduce ourselves. Mnie звати Silvio Stockman, я консультант DIHAG, and к сожалению, я не говорю по-русски и украински, so therefore I would like to present our presentation in English. Let us speak a little bit about ourselves. And firstly, DIHAG is a company that is based in the Eastern and Central Europe. We are headquartered near Dresden, and we are a foundry group that produces and smelters steel and iron. And you can imagine that these are components that are in very desperate need at the moment. And we are also a producer for parts for the Leopard tank and for other components. And we have also, and that is quite an interesting issue, we have a co-Ukrainian ownership. Two of our owners are from the Ukraine, or better to say, one is from the Ukraine, one is Ukrainian and Austrian. And let me allow you to give you a reflection from the United States. This is a country where I used to work with and then also had some exchange on the defense side. Now, there is a presidential decree by the Obama White House administration, which basically qualifies 16 sectors of national security importance. They include, or they are on the subject of critical infrastructure. That means energy, the defense industrial base, food, agriculture, nuclear reactors, transportation systems, critical manufacturing even though, and of course, roads, water systems, transportation. There was an investigation by the Department of Commerce, not just on steel, but also on aluminium. And it was very clear that steel and aluminium are indeed critical to the requirements of the United States Army, as well as the Marines, and of course the Air Force, and also to supply parts to the critical infrastructure sectors, as I mentioned. You can imagine you won't have a tank, you won't have a bridge, you won't have a ship without aluminium and steel. And aluminium is equally very much important as for protective armor. Steel is important, and iron is important for ammunition as well as for artillery. And at the moment, as you can imagine, you hear the numbers from the last security conference in Berlin. the numbers are dwindling. They are really not dwindling, they're mind-boggling. They're huge what the consumption is. And so something that I would like to highlight is, and here the US is really at the forefront of this thinking, is you have to think of your own industry that supplies your defense and basically provides your defense capabilities in a much different way today. And the US is really leading here, and the European Union, and particularly Germany, has to rethink. What is good, we have production, we have companies here, and DIHAG is one of them. You can see also at the bottom line that this is not something that I came up by myself, that you have the links here below. You see, really, this is a presidential directive. This is a policy in the United States. This is how they view security. And we Europeans, we have to wake up, especially in Germany, where we think or thought in the past, okay, everything is fine and neat. No, it's not. And as my previous speaker has explained, there's danger. It's wartime. And let's now move to the next slide. Okay, so I was mentioning the infrastructure in the Ukraine is impacted quite heavily. We have seen all the pictures, and you see here electricity, steel manufacturing, bridges, roads, rail, everything, even the capabilities on manufacturing and repair and supplying the defense, the army with ammunition as well as repairing tanks and artillery is heavily impacted. And we all know they largely depend on outside support, and without outside support, they couldn't advance on the ground. So we have to think about also from our European or Western perspective, how can we support this industry, but also the defense capabilities of the Ukraine, but also how should we rethink if aggression goes further and will not stop. So that is very imperative, and this is how we thought to kick off this the discussion and to provide our insight. Now let's move on to Germany. Mr. Wolski, we had this discussion in Berlin already, and with the then Minister of Defense in Germany, but also, and we have seen that in February there was a huge pledge made that 100 billion budget is available. Now, unfortunately, we haven't seen the orders. And there was a big discussion in one of the work groups where some of the members of the defense industry were very clear and saying, hey guys, give us just the orders. And why is this important? I mean, if you look at the ammunition, that's the biggest demand at the moment that probably the Ukraine has. But to be honest, we are depleting our own Western depots to support the Ukraine in its fight. But if we aren't replenishing, if we are not producing more artillery rounds or ammunition, then we are running out of steam, and then we are really naked, defenseless. And if you can see the numbers here, and these numbers are taken from a European specialist or expert on defense. I think he's working for the NATO. You see all the sources below from where we got this information. You can see that, you have a huge demand at the moment. In the Donbas battle, there was about 6,000 to 7,000 artillery rounds each day. If you compare this to like the Afghanistan war with 300 rounds, that's, it seems like an unbelievable number. But if you compare it to the production capabilities and capacities, and you can see here the US with 15,000 rounds each month, but then you know that the US is engaged on many fronts. And Mr. Wund just mentioned the logistical problems. How about the EU? How about Germany? How can we honestly say we can defend ourselves if we have an ammunition stockpile in Germany for just 2 days? You can see it on the left-hand side. These are questions. So I'm phrasing it, was ist das Problem? What is the problem? Obviously, money is there, but was ist das Problem? To be honest, I don't know the answer. All we know is we should be ready ourselves, and we are ready from the industrial side, to support our defense capabilities, and thus our very much security. Moving on to the next slide. I think, and I mentioned that before, we have to think differently. We are at war times, and that is something that brings us back to times and days that were like 50 and even more years ago. You have to think about your industry location-wise, collectively, differently. wartimes require a complete different thinking. What does it mean? It means that probably our productions need to be distributed. Our production needs to be maybe away from large industrial centers. They need to be placed, we have a German saying, in the pampa, in no man's land. But still, they have to be connected logistically. We also have to think about what kind of equipment do we need. We also have to think about maintenance, very important. We have to think about what standards should they use. Should it use Soviet style? Should it be NATO style? Should it be a mix? And how could we build up a grid, perhaps in Central and Eastern Europe, to leverage proximity, but also, like I said, a regionally distributed manufacturing. And of course, we need to think about funds. We know that the European Commission, the German Finance Ministry, we have the NATO, but we also have a Ukrainian defense industry, which has been quite big and very strong in the past. But we can collaborate, and there have been very interesting examples, for instance, cooperation with the Czech Republic, but also about, beefing up ammunition production outside of the Ukraine in so-called safer territories to help the Ukraine in its defense through the production by defense OEMs, tiers like DHAC, but also we need to think about the raw material and the power supplies. Without power, you cannot smelter. Without materials, you cannot produce. So we need to think about logistics, supplies, but also manufacturing capabilities. And what we need is a distributed and asymmetric defense industry partnership that perhaps works in clusters. And I would call for a private-public partnership in which governments, perhaps, and industry work together. Now, allow us to briefly present the DHAC group. So we are one of the largest non-automotive foundry groups in Europe. We are privately owned. We are comprising of 8 plants with 1,400 employees, and we have a very strong footprint in Central and Eastern Europe. Most of our plants are in Eastern Germany. They are in proximity to large business centers or metropolises, but they are not inside the metropolis or the big cities. We are outside of them. We have connection to rail and road and water, but we are also located in Poland and in Hungary. And of course, these are bordering countries to the Ukraine. We have also a small factory in the Czech Republic, which is not here mentioned, which helps us to do some mechanical work. But basically, we are also one of the oldest foundries in the world, and this is because of Saxony being one of the oldest iron and metal producing locations in the Middle Ages or the Middle East. And you can see most of these factories have a very strong legacy, but yet they are very modern. We have spent about 400 million in CapEx, and the latest one was just 10 years ago, and we spent just on this one 40 million euros, for instance, in Coswig. We have one of the most modern lines for steel production. What are our markets? What do we supply? We supply critical infrastructure. That is energy, wind, tidal wave, even coal, fusion, gas, and coal. So the conventional powers. Our reference clients, of course, are the big ones. We are a tier 1 to the OEMs of these markets. Mining, dredging, very important because you need the raw materials. And this is, of course, a booming industry at the moment. So it's surface mining, excavators, cranes, construction equipment. And of course, we're also providing the top OEMs of the world. In fact, basically, we provide them out of Europe, but they export to Africa and Asia with our equipment that they deliver to their logistic ports. Transport and agri-tech, also very important. I didn't mention before, but one of our owners, Mr. Petrov, he is Ukrainian citizen, but he is one of the largest owners or entrepreneurs in agriculture in the Ukraine. And he has been heavily impacted by the by the Russian war. And of course, he's fighting hell to keep up the agricultural production in the Ukraine, despite being that heavily impacted. But he's also engaged in DHAC. He has helped us a lot to invest and to get this company even bigger. And we are very grateful for his support. And maybe Mr. Babushak can explain a little bit more later on. But we are also providing other very important industry, and that is, for instance, the defense industry and the rail transportation industry. So at the moment, rail and defense is very important, because one is the logistics issue that was just explained by my previous presenter, but armored steel and drivetrain components, tanks, ammo parts are really, really in need. And we're providing the tiers there as well. We are a listed supplier, and we're working already with them on Puma, tank, and Boxer. What is also interesting and good is that we are deemed green already because our energy mix is better than the average in Germany. Now, let me summarize why we believe we could help the Ukraine in its horrendous fight against the Russian aggression, but also our very own security here in Europe. Because first, we are in state-of-the-art iron and steel foundry, and we can do small pieces of a 1 kilo up to 65,000 tons. We can do armored cast steel, Panzerstahl, Guss, and we have scalable equipment for that. And so I mean not only tank, but also artillery parts, including also parts made of iron, for instance, for ammunition. We're a listed supplier for Krauss-Maffei Wegemann as well as Rheinmetall. We are located off the large cities, but well connected to the transport. We have 8 plants, as I said, also in Eastern Europe. We have automated casting molding lines. And what is perhaps also a very interesting thing is that we have a Ukrainian co-ownership that is very open to collaborate on investment projects to build viable defense industry. And I'm telling you, not just for the Ukraine, but also for ourselves. I hope that this short presentation has given you a brief overview, and I would like to close this presentation with some thoughts and discussion with you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Stockmann. You talked indirectly about resilience. How do you basically build up resilience in a business which is quite energy consuming? So are you dependent on the Russian gas? Is your business and your production being inhibited by the gas delivery in times of this year?
Yes, basically we are our main source of energy is electricity and coal, but to a large extent it's electricity. We have, as I said, most modern equipment, so we don't depend on gas at this very stage. When I grew up, we had to manage shortages every day, and that experience bodes well when you're living in today's times.
Thank you very much indeed. There's one question also coming up. You talked about the 1 billion supply finance for the German armed forces. What would be your wish, basically, to faster procurement? Whom would you like to address in order to keep this process rolling?
Yeah, you really made a very good question and point here, and that's the pinnacle actually of it. Orders. What we need are orders, and it's just one time. They need to be recurring, because as you mentioned or aware of, the defense industry had been shrinking over the decades in Germany, and without orders you won't invest. So basically we need orders now. The orders are financed by the Ministry of Finance. Maintenance, and I think also ammunition, is not under the 100 billion package. It's running from the normal budget of the parliament or of the government. So the Ministry of Finance and the Parliament needs to get their act together. They have enough money. Nobody can tell me they don't have the money. They have the money, but they need to place orders. And the second issue, if I may add to this, is to change those stupid rules of taxonomy. Yeah, we had this discussion in Berlin, as you may remember. We say alcohol, tobacco, and the pornographic industry is something that is worse. But do you compare us, the defense industry, that provides basically the cover, the shelter for whatever we do, with pornographic or tobacco? That's totally stupid. That needs to be changed. And I think from the last discussion in Berlin, I understood that somebody in the parliament will pick this up. But, you know, we shouldn't wait. We shouldn't wait because the banks, they need to apply these rules.
Very much indeed, Mr. Stockmann, for your presentation. And we wish you good luck for the business. To the next member.
So, Transatlantic Dialogue Center is a KU-based NGO. Among our co-founders are the long and very experienced consultants in the sphere of international relations in Ukraine. And as you can judge from our name, the primary goal of the organization was the strengthening of Ukraine-United States ties. But with the start of the full-scale Russian invasion, the scope of our activities broadened a lot, and we are now working in several geographical directions, as well as dealing with different types of analysis. I would like to share my screen now, and hopefully you'll be able to see my presentation. We started organizing at first daily and then weekly briefings on the situation in Ukraine, and we have already created more than 125, and those include mostly factological information that we are sending to decision makers around the world to keep them informed. And besides that, we are also preparing analytics, and we are also both hosting visits by foreign politicians and analysts, as well as traveling abroad by ourselves with aim to advocate for some Ukrainian needs. And we are also actively cooperating with media, as one of our geographical programs is Latin America, and we are aiming to raise awareness about Ukraine in this region, and we consider it to be very important for the future and post-war Ukraine. So these weekly briefings have the form of newsletter with a few different sections based on international support, on the military situation, and on humanitarian situation. And we have a team of 80 dedicated volunteers who are helping us to organize them, and we are asking them to translate those briefings into 8 languages, so that we cover the broadest possible geographical space. As regards analytics, it also can be found on the website. We are now focusing on the most topical issues for Ukraine, and they all 90% of them are related to the Russian-Ukrainian war. And besides that, we are organizing expert discussions both in Ukraine and abroad. And our goal is to make people as involved as possible in the current situation, and find more people who can help Ukraine. Here you can see some photos of us hosting journalists and parliamentarians. As you can see, even German Minister of Justice and German analyst Gustav Gressel, who came to Kiev. One of our major researches last year was a nationwide survey commissioned by us and carried out by the leading sociology group Rating. It was carried out in November, and it was focused on a few main sections: attitude of Ukrainians to Germany, their vision of the future reconstruction of Ukraine, and their view of the current situation. And this is my practical contribution to today's discussion. And I hope this will let German audience understand what Ukrainians feel and what is their vision of the future, so to say. First part was on reconstruction, and it was interesting to find out that basically the majority of Ukrainians would like to see the reconstruction and repair of damage after the war is over. So they do not see a lot of sense in repairing something that can be destroyed by Russian rocket or missile tomorrow. And of course, people in the East are more tend to repair everything now, but the majority around the country is still in favor of finishing the war first. So that's also something that foreign decision makers should take into account, given the reconstruction of Ukraine is quite a topical issue now. And very interesting finding by us was that Ukrainians, when speaking of their needs, they told us that they, when choosing up from three answers, the 60% of people out of those three answers, they chose that relaunch of businesses and jobs is the most important issue. So this is where Germany and other Western countries can really help, and where we have our both points of growth, so that investments will create jobs, and these investments will generate income for our partners, and they will provide Ukrainians with jobs. The next priority was the damage repair, and the direct financial support to the population is, as we see, 1/3 less popular than giving people jobs. So that gives a bit of confidence in the future of Ukraine and of its reconstruction. As regards conflict-affected communities, the first and primary priority is communications and energy infrastructure. It is what Russians are now constantly shelling, and this is the reason why the civilian population of Ukraine is suffering most from. And only after that goes private housing and social infrastructure. And speaking of second priority, we see that social infrastructure was chosen as most important, and we believe that it's connected with current problems as due to air raid alarms, due to security situation. Children stay at home, they do not receive the necessary education. Kindergartens are not always working. We have the story of yesterday when unfortunately, in a helicopter crash, the leadership of our Ministry of Interior died, and it also included the injured and killed people from the kindergarten, because that helicopter basically fell on the kindergarten. So we also have a stories of conflict-affected areas where kindergartens and schools were targeted by Russians as potential places where Ukrainian soldiers may be. But due to poor Russian intelligence and reconnaissance, those are basically mostly targeted civilian objects without any soldiers inside. And it will be a big problem as schools and kindergartens will require a lot of repair in the future. And as regards foreign countries' involvement in the reconstruction, there is also an interesting finding, because a very small percent of Ukrainians, 13%, they believe that Ukrainian companies can use the frozen Russian money or the money from the Western countries to carry out the reconstruction works on their own without any supervision. And 55% of Ukrainians believe that supervision is needed, and countries that provide money should supervise Ukrainian companies. And another very interesting finding was that 29% of Ukrainians believe that foreign companies can be directly involved in the reconstruction process. And this figure is almost 3 times bigger than the variant that Ukrainian companies do it on their own. So basically, Ukrainians tend to believe more in foreign companies than into Ukrainian companies, and that's something that our partners can capitalize on as well. And as regards the situation with Ukrainians' willingness to fight, here you can see that the number of those who believe that war should continue until the liberation of all occupied territories, including Donbass and Crimea, has risen from 74 to 85% from March till November. And this gives a very little space for maneuver for Ukrainian leadership. And it's obvious that Mr. Zelensky should take into account the will of people, and most likely this war will be continued until the full liberation of the territories. The compromise variant of status quo as of 21st of February is satisfactory only to 9%. And what's interesting, only 4% of Ukrainians believes that Ukraine should continue fighting on the Russian territory after the liberation of Ukrainian territory. And it's also a good argument, because some people in the West say that we help Ukrainians and Ukrainians will not stop, and this will be a long war against Russia. So there is nothing to worry about in this regards. 85% of Ukrainians believe that the aim of the war that we are waging will be the liberation of all occupied territories, and that's all. That's why Ukrainians should stop. And speaking of the post-war status quo, people believe that the most effective measure to ensure Ukrainian security and that will deter Russia from future attacks is Ukraine's accession to NATO. So actually, when choosing from multiple answers, 61% of Ukrainians chose NATO membership as the best option. Another interesting finding is that Russian nuclear disarmament would also contribute to Ukraine's security. And that's possibly the consequence of Russian nuclear blackmailing in October, November, as we had this survey in end November. And people are really quite afraid of possible nuclear escalation, and they think that as Russia historically was never that friendly to Ukraine, having it nuclear will pose future threats for Ukraine. So 50% of Ukrainians believe that Russia should be nuclearly disarmed. Guarantees from Western countries and Ukraine's accession to the EU are seen as security guarantees by a third of Ukrainians, and Ukraine becoming a nuclear power, only 17% believe this. Interesting finding is that only 8% of Ukrainians believe that any peace agreement with Russia would guarantee Ukraine's security. So there is no trust in Russia's signing any documents, and the NATO is considered the only working option. And our last section of our survey was the attitude of Ukraine to Germany. And it's also a bit interesting, as we have, of course, a majority of those who believe Germany is a friendly or rather friendly country. And 33%, what's interesting, believe Germany is a neutral country, despite all of the humanitarian, financial, and military assistance that Germany did. And we decided to dig a bit more into this topic. And you can see historically how it changed over time. And on its peak, it was in October when there was a similar survey. And it was just a few days before a big missile attacks began against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. And Ukrainians at that time really believed that we are on the winning tide, and the war will finish soon, more or less soon. After the critical infrastructure strikes started, Ukrainians became more skeptical, and therefore from this we derive that it also impacted the attitude to other countries. And here you can also see the place of Germany with the rest of the countries that we analyzed. Of course, we have Poland, Lithuania, and Great Britain, who are the leaders. That can be explained by the fact that those were first countries who started helping Ukraine even before the full-scale invasion, and they are on the top list of our sponsors in terms of military assistance, and in terms of that share of that assistance to the GDP of those countries. And Ukrainians really appreciate it, and they really remember the countries that stood first to help Ukraine. Germany, in this regard, has quite like middle positioning, and still that's because of the a lack of military assistance, because military assistance is what Ukrainians are valuing most now, because that's what we believe is the main key to ending the war. And of course, you can see below the attitude to Hungary, which is even below the attitude to China, due to Hungary's position on not supporting Ukraine, and in some I don't know even how to say it. It's more closer to Russia even than to the position of the EU when we speak about the assessment of the Hungarian government of the war in Ukraine. And that's also will prevail for the years to come. And unfortunately, I don't believe that the attitude to Hungary will improve in the coming years. And that's what we decided to find out more about, is why Ukrainians believe that German is friendly or not friendly. And here what we found out, that the main reason why Ukrainians see Germany as friendly is because it supplies Ukraine with arms. And the second most popular answer is that it helps Ukrainian refugees. And it's also, speaking of the second two big reasons, is the continuing cooperation with Russia, and that Germany is not supplying everything it can. And there are even 5% of people that simply do not like Germany, and I guess that's where German soft power should work more. So those are key findings from our side, and I'd like to thank you for your attention and for your interest in Ukraine and for organizing this event. And we at TDC would be really interested in cooperating with German partners. I believe we can either help with visiting Ukraine, or we can provide the research, and we are always happy to have a dialogue and to help to build our bilateral relations. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'm open.
Well, thank you, Stepan, and also thank you very much indeed, actually, for making this Defense Day now working. I know it took quite an effort from you to get the speakers online and so on, and we carry on after the lunch break. But thank you first for making this happen together with us. I think we leave out the nuclear denuclearization of Russia, because I think that's not really a realistic one. But let me also ask you, if tomorrow in Ramstein there was the decision to deliver Leopard tanks, possibly not only from Germany but from the Leopard group, or the Leopard club as we say in Europe, how would that influence your poll?
Increase German attitude to Germany. It will be like a spike, I don't know, 15-20% more, because Ukrainians value most the weapons deliveries, and they appreciate our partners' position on that.
Thank you. We didn't talk about this survey about the 10 points peace plan. You know, the 10 points plan which your Prime Minister actually served out to UN and also to NATO and to the public. Have you asked in your survey about the realistics of that 10-point peace plan, which starts with nuclear protection and other pieces? Have you asked in your survey about that?
So unfortunately, at that time, it was not yet public and discussed in media, the 10-point plan. But we are planning to have surveys in the future and will then assess. But I believe that the majority of Ukrainians will be strictly in favor, because in this survey that I presented, we also had a block on the President Macron initiative on the broader European Commonwealth, and although it does not directly help Ukraine in winning war, 60% of Ukrainians positively evaluated this initiative as the more international attention to the Ukrainian cause, then the higher are chances that we will receive more assistance and will be able to win the war.
Mm-hmm. Do you see, and that's my last question from the chat, do you see a peace plan or peace efforts more in the United Nations, or do you see it in Europe in connection and support of the United States, of course? Where do you see basically the new security order after the war being melted together?
So the problem is that Russia occupies a seat in the Permanent Council of the Permanent Security Council of the United Nations. So it will be impossible to implement this plan on this level. So we are basically trying to have a broader international coalition, not within the framework of the UN and with the emphasis on the Western countries, but also we are now working with Africa and Latin America. And one of the initiatives that Ukrainian diplomacy is now undertaking is to replace Russia in this Security Council by some changing seats, so that our position is that Russia occupied the seat in 1991 as a successor of the Soviet Union, not according to the procedure, and it can therefore be disputed. So there is a chance in case we are successful in getting Russia out of the Security Council, that it can be done via the United Nations, but most likely is that the peace plan will be implemented mostly as today's sanctions are implemented by the will of the key Western countries, and that Russia will be forced to follow it in this case to avoid bigger economical damage or bigger sanctions.
Thank you very much indeed, Stepan. And you threw in just a very, very high legal question about Russia replacing the Soviet Union and United States United Nations Security Council. That's quite an interesting thing you threw on. And thank you very much indeed for your briefing, which was utmost interesting for our audience. And thank you also for your cooperation with the Behörden Spiegel. Thank you so much. Well done. Thank you. And
Thank you. It's our pleasure.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to have a break now, basically until 12 o'clock noon, and which is 1300 in Kiev time, but 1200 at our time. We will see it again with two other speakers from Ukraine. Thank you very much. See you then. Okay, dear audience, the former defense minister, Mr. Zaharodniuk, was cut off in the line. That happens, but we have online now Mr. Sviatoslav Jurash. Sviatoslav, are you in? Do you read us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent, excellent. He is a Ukrainian politician and a public figure. Mr. Jurash is the People's Party deputy in 2019. He was elected to the parliament and he is the youngest member of parliament of Ukraine. He studied at the University of Warsaw at the Faculty of International Relations. He returned to the Ukraine following the Revolution of Dignity. In December 2013, he established the Euromaidan Press Center, which played a crucial role in the protesters' information campaign. In 2019, he was awarded the Order of Merit, third grade, for his active participation in the revolution. From 2014 to 2019, he worked as a local producer for Fox News in Ukraine, covering the crimes of Russian and pro-Russian separatists in the occupied part of the Donbas. He has been a representative of the Ukrainian World Congress in Kiev since 2014. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine, he voluntarily joined the armed forces and also participated in the liberation of Bucha. Member of Parliament, Mr. Jurash, firstly, let me thank you also for your duty and braveness and that you fight for the free world. And we are free to receive your statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The reality is that in Ukraine, at that point, after the full-scale invasion, everybody was a fighter. Everybody was aiming to do their part to defend our country, because Putin had made very clear that his ambition here is destruction of our statehood and the annexation of our country. We are essentially aiming at one simple thing, with all this sacrifice, with all that each and every one of us is taking up in this battle. We are aiming at freedom. We're aiming to choose our own destiny, and we want for our country to be able to craft its own path into the future without the commands of the Russian pretenders to our own destiny. As far as the vision for Ukrainian future, it's very clear and very laid out in Ukrainian law and Ukrainian reforms. We are not just aiming at becoming part of the European community, we are becoming part of that. In this battle that we are waging, we essentially are showing that we are capable and willing to defend our Euro-Atlantic future, and with that in mind, we need support of people like yourself, of people that essentially in the West can see this and can try and support our efforts to battle against the indifference of many and support us in joining the institutions which we are defending here in the front lines.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And the other question is, of course, we feel that Ukraine is quite a master in strategic communications. Now, I mean, starting with your president, the strategic communication of the war, I think, is on the Ukrainian side. Do you see that as well, or do you feel endangered by Russian false news and so on? How do you feel strategic communication in this war?
I mean, so the reality is that the Russians aren't trying to place their chief effort on the pro-Russian position in the West. They're trying to stimulate and support indifference, to support isolationism, and that sentiment comes in the West from sides both on the right and on the left. And basically they're still pushing at that month after month, counting that as the war drags on, the West will be tired of it and therefore give up on Ukraine. And I'm very glad to see the commitment by the Western leadership to try and support our struggle throughout everything. And as far as our communication abilities, well, it is just as good as your attention in the West. So events like this, it helps greatly to try and present our case and present our battle. And I thank you very much for allowing us to tell the story of our fight.
Thank you. In your terms and your view, what would be the current and most needed actions politically from from the EU and from NATO? What's required politically from EU and NATO?
Well, if you look at the Russian exports into EU, Russian exports actually in most countries of the EU have grown, and it's basically because of the rise in prices of oil and gas, and the fact that plenty of countries in the EU are still buying up Russian energy, by that subsidizing the war effort here in Ukraine. There are plenty more that can be done to try and curtail that or punish countries within EU that are essentially not deciding not to understand the severity of the situation and not to respond to it. So politically speaking, basically the cutoff to Russian supply of money from the West is something that will help greatly.
Okay, thank you. Another part of the war is, of course, the cyber war, and we learned, I think, also in a defense day recently that Ukraine actually could well defend against cyber attacks from the Russians. What is your mind on the cyber attacks and the resilience of Ukraine in this type of war?
Well, with the cyber front line, the reality is that the war has been going on for much longer. Russians have been probing cyber defenses throughout these years, and our capability has only improved because of it. We basically had the chance to practice, and plenty of other actors in the West have come here to Ukraine to learn from Ukrainians who essentially are in the cyber trenches every single day, diffusing different malware and different type of electronic threats that Russia is sending onto Ukraine. And it's because of the fact that Ukraine has a vibrant IT sector that essentially grew throughout our independence and became one of the biggest chunks of Ukraine's economy. Let me just say that number 2 and number 3 richest man in Ukraine now actually are people from the IT business, and that meant a huge growth in capable individuals who are now on their back and on their experience holding this fight together.
Thank you. You talked about the lack of artillery and guns. Is it also more requirement of ammunition, or is it just the weapon systems? What's your view on that?
Well, as far as the artillery is concerned, it is basically ammunition, which is in dire need. The quantities that are spent here on the front lines are eye-watering. The assessments I've seen, we're basically using up the equivalent of some of the European countries' whole supply of ammunition in a week, basically. And the reality is that for that reason, HIMARS systems are wonderful, but the rockets to them are most needed to try and make the difference in this battle. As far as the weapon system, obviously you've heard about tanks being needed. I was simply speaking about my experience holding the trenches near Bakhmut, and the defense experience of seeing lack of our artillery in play in that battle. But obviously what we are continuing and what we are planning is the liberation of Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine. For that, Ukraine direly needs tanks, about which plenty has been spoken, and basically we need the strategic tanks that the West has developed, and we need many more of them to try and retake different parts of Ukraine that Russia has seized in this inhuman war.
Is the if you're talking about defense and basically in the trenches, do you have enough anti-tank capacity? Means anti-tank missiles and so on. Is that a requirement?
Well, as far as any tank is concerned, basically, I very much want to thank our British partners and the fact that during Trump administration, they actually made decision to supply us with some weapons, and primarily anti-tank weapons. And in the first days around Kiev, those were key to try and destroy the ability of the Russians to use their armor as easily as they planned to. But as far as the battles now raging, that is needed because the Russians, whatever they're planning, and the next step will be trying to utilize their huge quantity of tanks in that process. So there is nothing that is enough as far as anti-tank is concerned.
Mm-hmm. In your view, do you see the danger of a normalization of the war in the Western world, since it's going on basically for 1 year now? Do you see the danger in the public opinion that says, yeah, war is going on? How is your view on that?
Sadly, it's happening already, normalization in that sense. But as far as Ukraine is concerned, we are very much trying to make the case with the victories we are having around Kharkiv, around Kherson, to showcase to the West this isn't just a battle we can fight, but this is a war we can win. And therefore, our point simply is keep us in this fight. Russia is your biggest strategic threat. Russia has always made a very important investment in trying to destroy institutions of the West, be that EU, be that NATO, or trying to support extremes in all of your countries. And we are defaming Russia right now. We're destroying the strategic capability to be your menace and to be your security threat for this century. Support us in this fight and therefore allow us not just to win our war that Russia has waged on us, but also allow us to demolish Russian ability to be a menace to you all.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's also a question from the chat. What is the current status of the Ukrainian defense industry? And you know that the West is supporting Ukraine, but there has to be a kind of interconnectivity between Ukrainian defense industry and what we supply. What's the status? How do you see that?
Well, it is being restructured and rethought. There was plenty of change in leadership for Ukrainian defense sector that we've seen throughout the war. And again, our need to try and rebuild and restructure defense industry is here to basically restock on the different things that Ukraine has spent in this fighting this war. But the reality is, when you look at defense sector, it is major part of our economy. It always has been, and for us to rethink and rebuild it to wage this war more effectively is something that basically is fundamental plan of our economic sector and will be in the years to come.
Thank you. How do you, last question before we let you off the hook, what's your view for the next 3 months? Say what will happen according to your view, your experience in the trench lines and your political parliamentary background? What will happen within the next 3 months, let's say?
From different indicators that we are seeing, the Russians are planning something, that are planning attack, and basically various different options are now discussed as a possibility, but the reality is that we don't know. Therefore, we have to reinforce different parts of the front lines. Even though they are waging attacks constantly in Donbass, and we are trying to hold them off there, they probably will not stop and not satisfied with the current reality on the ground. They will relaunch something, and it's not an accident that you see all the talk about another attack on our capital or another attack in the south. The reality is that's basically very much what the Russians are aiming for, to put us in a point to the point where basically we have to abrogate our ability to wage war. And Russians have been training the hundreds of thousands of conscripts that they've called up in the so-called partial mobilization they've had for many months now. And the reality is that for that reason, we are preparing for all the possibilities, while also discussing with all of our partners and allies the ability to receive weapons which allow us to continue retaking parts of Ukraine that Russia has so arrogantly and so unlawfully in every single way seized since the 24th February.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Of course, it's still remains a war crime from Mr. Putin. We know all that. But how do you see? Actually, that is the last question. Do you need to strike logistics and military command posts on Russian ground? Would you go that far with long-range weapons?
Well, that's exactly what we were doing, basically. The reality is, I mentioned the lack of ammunition for our artillery and the artillery complexes we're receiving from the West. But so hence we need to use it carefully. So basically that was the reality of warfare at the moment. We essentially were trying with our intelligence to find out where Russians are keeping their ammunition logistics centers and hit them hard. And we've been successful. You've seen plenty of those examples throughout this war, but we will continue doing that because the reality is that Ukraine is fighting a patriotic war, and plenty of people that remained in the occupied territories will support their country coming back to them and tell us what the Russians are doing there. Therefore, Russians actually were pulling out various logistical centers from occupied parts of Ukraine and seeing as we are destroying them one by one. And we'll continue aiming at destroying the Russian capability to wage this war. We have seen the examples of how these attacks, these strikes were essentially key to Russians leaving Kherson and allowing us to retake the only regional capital Russia has captured since the beginning of full-scale invasion. So pinpoint attack to destroy the Russian capability to be effective on the front lines is very much the reality of our tactics.
Okay, thank you. We let you off the hook, Member of Parliament.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your braveness, and good luck to you and your family. And you know that the West is standing by to support and do as much as they can. Thank you very much indeed for that interview.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much. All the best.
Goodbye. Thank you. Yes, dear audience, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we cannot connect to the former defense minister and Member of Parliament, Sarah Rodniuk. There's a loss of power in that area. So we have to close, basically, this session of the DSO Defense Day. But to conclude is quite difficult. What came out, basically, is the requirement for tanks, best Leopard, and the best would be in a battalion-sized number, better in a brigade-sized number. I think from the Leopard club in Europe, there's 12 nations having Leopard as a weapon system. So that's one urgent need, which was highlighted by all our speakers today. The other question is basically, is Russia the legal successor in the Permanent Security Council member? So that quite has to be researched, I think, on the legal side. And from the tanks, possibly there's a sidestep. The Kingdom of Jordan is just phasing out more than 100 Challenger 1 tanks. Possibly it would be an idea to ship them down and give them to Ukraine. And of course, the most important question is we have to stand by the Ukraine and support them. And the Behörden Spiegel will remain seized with the matter of Ukraine. Thank you very much indeed for your alertness, for your questions, and to be with us in this Defense Day, which was a real live Defense Day into the Ukraine, and talking with the speakers. I will hand over to Mrs. Frank now for closing remarks. Thank you very much indeed. Goodbye.
Thanks to all the speakers and participants of this Defense Day, and a special thanks to the members of the Ukrainian Parliament. We wish you success in your fight for your freedom, and we will support Ukraine as long as it takes. Thank you.